against all the evil that hell can conjure, all the wickedness that mankind can produce, we will send unto them only you. Rip and tear until it is done.
When people talk about Doom, they usually mean one of two things. They're either talking about the 1993 original, which basically invented the first-person shooter as we know it, or they're talking about the rebooted series that started in 2016, which tried to reinvent it all over again. In both cases, Doom has always been about speed, about violence so exaggerated it loops back around to being funny, and about the power fantasy being one very angry man in a very bad place with very big guns. But the Dark Ages is trying something a little different. This time the bad place isn't Mars, or a cyberpunk Earth filtered through hell, or even hell itself. This time it's a medieval battlefield. Castles, shields, siege engines, dragons, the works. And it asks a strange, but for this video at least, an important question. If you peel away the science fiction dressing that's defined Doom for decades at this point, what's left? If you strip the series down to the myth it's been edging towards since Eternal, maybe even arguably the 2016 Doom, well, what does that look like? The Doomslayer has been painted as everything from a space marine with anger issues, to the literal messianic figure who exists just to kill and banish demons until the concept of demons itself ceases to exist. Eternal certainly leaned into that harder than ever, with giant swords, winged monsters, angels and demons, biblical overtones everywhere you looked. The Dark Ages therefore feels like the natural endpoint of that trajectory. So sure, why not? Why not go the whole way? Why not drop the Slayer into a world of myths, monsters, dragons and medieval carnage, and see if he still fits? In this video I'm going to deep dive into Doom: The Dark Ages. Now usually I'm more interested in how games tell stories, but here I think I'll be digging into how this one actually plays. You know, its mechanics, its rhythms, the texture of the combat, more so than the lore. It's a bit of a shift for me, but I think Doom's worth it. Now having said that, full spoilers for the full NuDOOM trilogy ahead. I think it's quite easy to dismiss the story, the codex entries, and the characters as overwritten and, well, underdeveloped, let's say that. To some extent, I think that's true. But that also makes it a pretty good place to start this video. Because that impulse was already there in 2016, lurking in the darkest shadows and recesses of that game's most excessively dramatic lore entries. Eternal took that impulse and cranked it up, building a whole war between heaven and hell in between its neon-sprayed bursts of heavy metal ripping and tearing. And the Dark Ages doubles down even harder. If 2016 flirted with the idea of being secretly lore-heavy, and Eternal moved in together with it to try and make things work, then the Dark Ages put a ring on it and started planning a whole family. Doom, OG boomer shooter Doom I mean, it didn't really have a story. It had elements that if you squinted hard enough started to look like the shape of a story maybe. You know, you're on Mars, something about a teleporter experiment gone wrong, and now demons are everywhere. It was, to put it politely, a sketch of a story that was written on loading screens and in the game's manual. That's all the why you were ever going to get, but honestly, it was enough. Because the point wasn't the lore, it was the demons, the guns, the gory, glorious catharsis of turning an army of hellspawn into twitching piles of red pixels. A one-man crusade against the army of darkness, a basic, primal satisfaction. Doom is, in many ways, the quintessential video game. In that sense, Doom 2016 was a much more faithful update of the original formula than the games that would follow it. Certainly more faithful than the game I'm going to spend most of this video with. Its cast list was short. The Slayer, Samuel Hayden, Olivia Pierce, and a whole heap of demons. And that's pretty much it. The UAC facilities, the Mars setting, the half-sketched energy experiments gone wrong, it all served as background noise, a loose framework to keep you moving from one arena to the next. The Slayer himself didn't seem to pay much attention to the details, so neither did we. Even its ending, where you square up against a cyber spider mastermind, it's a deliberate echo of the original Doom's final boss. Which I guess raises the question, if the Doomslayer really is the same guy across all these games, as the Dark Ages and Eternal certainly imply, how hard must the deja vu must have been hitting him in 2016? You know, you wake up, you see Mars on fire again, you get shoved towards a portal to hell, and fight a giant spider, all over again. He's basically trapped in the FPS version of Groundhog Day. The point before I get sidetracked is this. 2016 kept things simple, and in doing so, it kept them satisfactorily supplementary to the main course of that game, its gameplay. Contrast that with Doom Eternal, where the series took a hard left into operatic lore dumping. Suddenly you've got makers, betrayers, giant prophecies, entire codexes worth of pseudo-biblical myth. You're watching long cutscenes instead of just punching through the glass to get on with the killing. The Dark Ages takes this approach and really runs away with it, opening with sprawling cutscenes and carefully constructed setups that almost feel embarrassed to just admit you're about to kill demons all over again. And yet that's exactly what the early parts of the Dark Ages boil down to. The Dark Ages begins in media res, which is a polite way of saying it skips past a lot of things you'd probably like to know, I guess. The Dark Ages is technically a sequel to Doom 64, except it leaps ahead of the whole burned by the embers of Armageddon, his soul blistered by the fires of hell, and tainted beyond ascension, he chose the path of perpetual torment. In his ravenous hatred he found no peace, and with boiling blood he scoured the umbral plains, seeking vengeance against the Dark Lords who had wronged him. You know, that thing described in the Slayer's testaments. It skips ahead instead to a point where the Doom guy has already been captured and rebranded as the Maker's Slayer. Which means we've also skipped past the flashbacks glimpsed at in Eternal Zone narrative, where the Slayer was first trans-dimensional portaled to Argent D'Nur from hell, rambling and raving.
Guts. Huge guts.
That probably would have been a good place to start, but no. Instead of starting us at the start of his arc with the Night Sentinels and seeing the origin story for this Slayer played out, he's already got glowing eyes, a new doohickey on his chest, and seemingly spends his time in a similar way to how I used to spend my shifts at McDonald's, staring into space, watching the clock tick down. How or why any of this happened? The game doesn't really commit to saying anything at all. I honestly don't think this is an altogether bad thing though. We saw enough in Eternal to piece together everything we need to jump into this game. And playing an origin story, 3 games and 2 DLCs that, to be honest, may as well be games in themselves deep into the series at this point, doesn't really, honestly, excite me. We're instead dropped feet first into a couple different arenas to save the Night Sentinels and the people of Argent D'Nur and the Maker's precious energy extraction operations. And while all this is happening, the Dark Ages is, at the same time, a prequel to Doom 2016, except it doesn't bother explaining how he ends up napping inside that coffin you pry open at the start of that game. Presumably this is territory for DLC or a sequel, again. And that's the part I don't love. It reminds me of Halo 2's ending, which effectively shrugged and told players, see you in a few years. Even though Halo 3 eventually did deliver a satisfying follow-up, the experience of being cut off in the moment wasn't that fun. The Dark Ages seems to be walking a similar path, dangling unfinished story threads with the expectation that of course we'll come back, and pay again later, just to tie them off. I say again because this feels familiar, right? It's because Doom Eternal already tested those very same murky waters. Its main campaign ends with a mess of unresolved arcs. Valen, the Betrayer, for example, gets set up as this big, tragic figure, and his lore entry is, at the very least, intriguing. The Night Sentinels stood strong against our legions. Conquest of Argent D'Nur, empowered by the Wraith energy, was foiled at every turn. Yet in our darkest hour came a lowly hell priest, Deag Grav, and in his guidance a weakness in a heathen of the Night Sentinels was found. The bargain was struck thus: for the return of the Betrayer's own son, lost on the battlefield, Deag Grav must be taken to the source of their power, the elemental wraiths. Led there by the wretched Betrayer, Deag Grav and his cabal set a curse upon the wraiths as they slept, and used their essence for our own devices. With the power of the wraiths they formed the well, that which brings us upon our enemies. Thus the city of Argent and their false gods fell under the unholy might of the Hell Priests. For his payment, the betrayer's son was returned to him in our form, and the icon of sin was brought upon the heathens. His vengeance was swift and merciless, for the wages of treachery are suffering. With the fall of Argent Nur, their realm was taken into ours, their temples and ruins, their carved rock and edifice, all was absorbed into our realm and taken as trophies of our triumph. I'll talk about how disappointing Valen's arc and the Icon of Sin are a little later in the video. For now, I'll say that it's theoretically cool in retrospect that these two characters fought together once upon a time. The Slayer and the Betrayer's brief reunion in Eternal lands a little better once you have the full context that the Dark Ages provides. Thin as it is, there's clearly world building going on behind the scenes. The problem is that much of it amounts to a vague gesture at, remember this guy? The thing is, we don't remember them because the games haven't actually given them arcs yet. Still, even what world building there is often made weird and confusing when placed in the context Eternal gave. The Dark Ages is, in theory, that foundational story I just described. The betrayal that doomed Argent Nur. But, it isn't, is it? We don't see any wraiths foiling the conquest of Argent Nur. We don't meet Deag Grav, the priest that will lead Valen to betray his sentinels. I know, you could call it all delayed gratification, but at some point, you just have to commit. It's been close to 10 years since we started all of this. Just tell the story you keep pointing at. What makes this especially frustrating is that Doom has never needed complicated lore to justify itself. The series is at its best when it's primal, mythic, and faintly ridiculous. You wake up, you hate demons, you kill your way through heaven and hell until the screen fades to credits. That works. That's pure. But somewhere along the way, the games got tangled up in angelic politics, betrayals, and ancient prophecies, without actually committing to resolving any of it in the text you've already paid for. So with the Dark Ages, I think we're left in a strange place. The story is technically moving forward, or mapping backwards I guess, but narratively it's still circling the runway. Eternal left us with a cliffhanger of an ending, and then made us pay extra and fight through 2 DLCs to resolve it. Something very few people ended up doing. The Dark Ages is, to be honest, a little unbelievable in doing the same thing again, while everyone waits to see if anyone, is ever going to actually land the plane. So anyway, all of that is my long-winded way of setting up my main point for this section. Better late than never, I guess. Someone at id has spent a long time creating lore and backstory to this world. Someone at id has spent a long time writing about things that we don't see, to flesh out characters that often barely register. To give meaning to things that ultimately don't need it. You usually have to go out of your way to collect these lore entries that give the world some semblance of structure, and it usually spoils the flow of gameplay. It grinds all the shooting and ripping and tearing to a sudden and monotonous halt while you stop to read a paragraph or two. But that impulse to flesh out this world, it's interesting. To me at least, to give story and lore, and lots of it, to something that arguably needs very little justification. And to do it in a way that pretty impressively pulls together all 3 modern Doom games with mostly consistent world building and lore, it's also interesting. I know Doom is all about ripping and tearing until it's done, but by giving the game a scaffolding, a structure that holds the whole thing up, I personally did end up feeling more invested in the whole ripping and tearing business. I can't say hand on heart that I cared all that much individually about the character of King Novik, or his daughter Thera, first of her name, Princess of Argent Nur, Commander of the Night Sentinels, and Wraith Wrangler. I can't say the struggles of the Night Sentinels ever became overly compelling in themselves, but that scaffolding, cumulatively, well, it worked for me. Either way, whether you enjoy the plight of the Sentinels or not, it never really mattered because the gameplay loop is deeply, deeply satisfying. The locations you go to are gorgeous, and the beats of the story are all cool as hell. Over the course of Dark Ages campaign, you do things that are both profoundly stupid and profoundly awesome, often at the same time. You'll crack open an ancient extra-dimensional prison just to let Cthulhu loose, and then resolve that mistake by punching it to death in a mech the size of a skyscraper. You'll saddle up on a dragon whose wings double as laser arrays, belching incinerating flames down a demon's throat until it's burnt out from the inside. At one point you die. Full stop, end of story, except this is a game about the Doomslayer, too angry to follow narrative convention or logic, so you burst out of a coffin anyway. And just to round it all out, you finish by killing the Prince of Hell with a medieval flail. It's all very silly and very cool, and I personally adore it. I know I've been pretty negative on the world building so far, but at the risk of sounding contradictory, I keep coming back to a simple question. Would the game be better without those cutscenes and the lore entries? I don't think it would. They give context to the chaos, even if that context is often convoluted, sometimes disposable, and increasingly reliant on the promise of DLC coming soon. I guess that's how I'll wrap this section. I just wish the story felt more willing to close its own loops instead of saving them for a later product. But in the moment, when you're riding a death laser dragon into a sky full of screaming demons, well, that spectacle more than earns its place. When I first sat down to write this section, I drafted a whole argument about how different each of the modern Doom games really is. 3 entries, 3 distinct takes on what it means to be the Doomslayer, each demanding different instincts, different rhythms. You can feel the superficial shift between them pretty clearly, I think. But the more I went back over it, the less convinced I became. Like a lot of arguments I tend to have with myself on the typical Monday night, it started sounding clever but didn't really hold up to scrutiny. Because yes, 2016, Eternal, and the Dark Ages all pull you in slightly different directions. They do ask you to be 3 different flavors of the deliverer of Doom, but they also share a spine, a design ethos about what combat in NuDOOM should feel like. I won't spend too long with the earlier games. I think they deserve their own videos with time, but if you'll let me, I'd like to hash out some of my earlier thoughts for a minute, so that the script doesn't go completely to waste before I tell you why it's completely wrong. Going back to 2016 from the Dark Ages for this video was quite jarring, to be honest. The blueprint for what Eternal and the Dark Ages would become is right there, etched into the bones of the design of that first game, but it isn't quite the same beast yet, is it? If you've played it, you know the combat isn't as fast, it's not as mechanically dense. Don't get me wrong, it's still fast compared to your average Halos or COD campaign, but you don't have quite as many buttons to juggle, or as many plates to keep spinning in the air, literally in the air in Eternal's case, in 2016. Still, the foundation of NuDOOM combat is unmistakable. Chainsaw a smaller demon and out pops a bunch of ammo. Punch your way through a glory kill and your health meter gets topped up. These are the rhythms that would go on to define the series, the loops that transform these games from a simple run and gun into something more like a resource management game with shotguns and pinky demons. But because you're working with larger ammo reserves in 2016, the systems don't feel quite as razor's edge as they do in Eternal. You can lean on a favorite gun or two for long stretches without the combat loop punishing you for it, and enemies are less prescriptive about how they expect to be handled. The result is that, despite the mechanical overlap, the 2 games don't actually play that similarly at all. 2016 feels almost sandbox-like in how it frames its encounters, an open invitation to fight the way you think is fun, whether that means a super shotgun blast all the way down, or swapping weapons only when the mood strikes. Eternal, as I'll get into in a moment, it's not that. What really separates 2016, though, isn't really the systems. It's the texture, the art direction, that has this oily industrial weight to it, all steel and fire and brimstone in equal measure. Walking the surface of Mars with orange dust swirling, or clambering bright yellow industrial cranes, or pacing down a darkened corridor as warning lights blare, everything in 2016 has a grounded, lived-in, real feel. It's a horror game that lets you fight back. And creature design leans heavier into the horror too, with demons that look like they were sculpted in meat and bone before they were animated into game models. I guess this is personal preference, but I don't think the demons have ever looked as good as they do in 2016. And the sound design, the varied guttural shrieks and snarls of the menagerie of demons, the thunder of the super shotgun or the heavy assault rifle, well, it all has a rawness and a crunchiness that Eternal and the Dark Ages have managed to not capture as well. And if that isn't subjective enough for you, I also think the 2016 soundtrack is the best of the series too. The core of Doom has always been this strange cocktail of action, horror, and comedy. The ratio changes from entry to entry, but the mixture is always there if you look for it. Which one stands out most to you probably says more about your own taste than about the game itself. For me, Doom 2016 hit the sweet spot. The action was relentless, the horror had real teeth, and the comedy was there enough to cut through without tipping into farce. That was mostly thanks to the glory kills, that often played like a little bit of a punchline. You know, more Looney Tunes than Lovecraft. While the Slayer's dismissive attitude towards Samuel Hayden, the way he wordlessly shoves the plot aside when it gets in the way, felt like the most honest joke the game could have told about itself. You and the Doomslayer both, you're not here for plot. But the atmosphere, the lighting, the creature design, that was still clearly horror first and foremost, with action as its major expression. Eternal recalibrated the balance a little bit. Horror all but vanished from its palette, save for a few designs carried over from 2016. In its place was spectacle, in bucket loads. The comedy is broader and the action louder. Glory kills are played bigger and sillier, and the whole thing takes on a kind of neon carnival energy. Where 2016 felt grungy, metallic, and oppressive, Eternal is saturated with colour, breezy where its predecessor was claustrophobic. I don't think it's that one approach is more authentic to the quote-unquote soul of Doom than the others. It's that each of them is leaning on a different corner of that triangle of action, horror, and comedy. And that makes sense if you look back at Doom's roots. This is a series born in the cultural slipstream of things like Aliens and Evil Dead. Films that themselves never quite settled on whether they were action, horror, or comedy first, and in some ways thrived on being all three at once. Cameron's Aliens is still horror at its core, but it's painted over with bravado and pulse rifles. Alien vs. Predator is still one of the most unintentionally funny movies I think I've ever watched. Evil Dead 2 turns the grisly violence of the first film into slapstick comedy. Army of Darkness went fully into absurdist comedy before the 2013 reboot decided to be a serious horror movie again. Confession time. I hated Doom Eternal the first time I played it. And not even mildly disappointed hated it, I mean bounced off it so hard I didn't make it through the second level. By the time I finally booted it up, I was already a fair few months, maybe even a year behind everybody else, and the very first thing it greeted me with was a parade of user agreements, splash screens, and news updates about gaudy skins and seasonal passes I could now gratefully pay for on top of the initial price tag. Apparently the initial promise had been no microtransactions or storefront, and the gamers rejoiced. That purity was part of the pitch, part of why people rallied behind it. Here, finally, was a first-person shooter that would resist the tide of endless monetization, where ripping and tearing would stand triumphant over nickel and diming. Well, that may have been the case at launch, but by the time I had the disc spinning up, well, that was no longer true. I personally don't have much of an issue with microtransactions, beyond the general disappointment that unlocking stuff through gameplay, well, it's just not much of a thing anymore. It's part of the reason I think I never stuck to Halo Infinite the way I had with Reach. But I get it, companies need to make money, and it's a truth self-evident that microtransactions make companies a lot of money. Anyway, the point is, before I'd even pulled the trigger once, I was already rolling my eyes. Looking back, it probably wasn't that bad, but at the time it felt like an eternity just getting back into the ripping and tearing I had loved so much in the 2016 game. That bad taste didn't exactly fade once the game started. Everything about it felt wrong. Gone was the grisly industrial horror vibe of 2016. In its place, neon pickups, extra lives, and UI flourishes that looked like they'd been stolen from an arcade cabinet. Even the Slayer himself felt off. I couldn't believe that you can't melee a basic zombie to death. I was constantly out of ammo. Weapon swapping felt clumsy and desperate. The pace was so blisteringly fast that I was sure no human could actually hit an imp with anything other than blind luck. And the platforming? Well, I'm not sure I can summon the words to describe my initial impression of the platforming. I kept forgetting you had to press a button to grab a wall, which meant the supposed one-man army of hell spent most of his downtime belly flopping into lava like a Doomguy-shaped lemming. By the time level 2 opened with another stretch of awkward jumping puzzles, I was done. I shut it off, filed it under bad sequels, and didn't look back. Until this year. I only returned to it after the Dark Ages hooked me so well. I loaded it up this year ready to demolish it. I was prepared to write the kind of smug, overconfident takedown where every complaint was framed as proof that Eternal had betrayed everything its siblings got right. I was fully ready to finally transition into a real YouTube video essayist, complete with a dramatic thumbnail where Doom Guy frowns disapprovingly under the words "Eternal is bad" in impact font, and a script sharpened to a point that would turn every nitpick into irrefutable evidence that I was the first person in history to be correct on the internet. The thing is, I was wrong back then, or maybe I just wasn't in the right headspace in the early 2020s. I don't know, that time was kind of wild, right? Anyway, I was the kind of wrong where you start arguing with the game, only to realize halfway through that it's patiently waiting for you to catch up. So instead of the takedown I'd convinced myself was inevitable, I'm left with something a lot less flashy. A section of this essay about how Eternal is great, the Dark Ages is equally great, and how both of them are better for being so different. Which is maybe less clickable, but, well, it's a lot truer. Doom Eternal's combat is unlike any first-person shooter I've ever played. It talks to you. And boy, it's a chatterbox. Every single second of a fight, the game is asking you questions. What do you need right now? Out of ammo? Chainsaw that imp and you're suddenly rolling in bullets. Taking too much damage? Flame belch a crowd and armor spills out like a piñata. Are you on your last legs? Go ahead and trigger that glory kill over there and get a bucket load of neon blue health from a demon's now severed insides. The game is constantly asking and constantly giving you a way to answer. Before I get too deep into the praise for this system though, there is one wrinkle in the combat loop I never quite passed, and that's the grenade launcher. It's technically useful, but the central loop, the big back and forth between health, ammo, and armor, I think it could have carried the whole show without this relic from Doom 2016. Maybe I'm missing something. What's remarkable about Eternal is how natural this dialogue all becomes once you get fluent in its particular language. As I said with my initial experience with the game, at first it feels like an argument. The game's opening level felt like it was constantly screaming at me that first time I booted up the game back in 2021. Coming from the 2016, it was just too much change. I kept running out of ammo, and the demons felt like they hit too hard. Especially the early Arachnotrons, they just felt like bullet sponges. But once you learn the rhythm, it becomes pretty instinctual. Almost romantic. Like being with a partner you've known for years, where you don't need to ask what they're thinking anymore because you already know. And equally, they don't need to ask you anything anymore either. You see a fodder demon, an imp or a zombie or a soldier, and immediately register it not as an enemy but as an ammo station with legs. In fact, because of my terrible aim, the chainsaw was often much easier to use to take down the constantly jumping around imps. You feel yourself taking damage, and almost without thinking you set something on fire and suddenly you're clinking around in fresh armor again. A full green bar, the answer to the screams of some poor demon. And because the cooldowns are tuned just short of generous, you almost always have one of your recovery tools ready to go in any moment of panic. If 2016 had already made glory kills feel like a useful bonus, Eternal brings them fully central. They're the punctuation that keeps the combat sentences flowing. Where in 2016 it was nice to see a demon glowing as a little flare, in Eternal the glory kills are the essential lifeblood that keeps you in the fight. They're a reliable, immediate answer to the question of how do I keep going? If you're low on health, there's no rummaging through menus, no scouring for medkits tucked in corners, and there's certainly no hiding. You rip and tear your health directly out of some poor demon's body. Few FPS mechanics have managed to feel so purely utilitarian and so gleefully excessive at the same time. Because, beyond their essentialness to the combat loop, glory kills also inject a ridiculous amount of personality to the violence you are able to inflict on the denizens of hell. They're silly, sometimes even slapstick, especially when you feed a Mancubus's own power core or tear a Cacodemon's eye out on the end of your arm blade like a kebab skewer. The exaggeration is deliberate, and the timing is so perfectly tuned to the rhythm of combat that the loop itself becomes addictive. Because it sustains you, yes, but also because, it's just sheer entertaining. This is where Eternal leans hardest into its Evil Dead 2 influence. Not horror played straight, but horror turned comic. A chainsaw ballet of slapstick brilliance that lets grotesque violence land with the timing of a joke. Or maybe I just grew up watching too many horror movies, and it's forever impacted my sense of humor. Who's to say, really? Looking back, the blood punch in Eternal feels like a prototype for the melee focus that the Dark Ages would later build an entire combat system around. It's a melee attack on a cooldown, sure, but more importantly, it's a way of nudging you forward constantly, rewarding you for getting in close instead of hanging back. It slots neatly alongside the chainsaw and the glory kills, all of them little mechanics designed to keep you aggressive, to keep you moving, to stop you from treating Doom like any other shooter where cover is safety and distance is the strategy of choice. Here, safety is offense, and distance is, well, it's just wasted time between the slaughter. The blood punch is that big, messy exclamation mark at pivotal moments of a fight, when all the building pressure boils over and you finally get to detonate it across some demon's ribcage. Honestly, part of me wishes Eternal had gone further with the whole system. Ditched the ammo and health pickups that lie scattered around arenas and really force players to commit to that conversational loop. As it stands, those little glowing breadcrumbs, they sometimes feel like a little bit of a mixed signal. They keep you alive, yes, but I think they also undercut just how fully the combat system can sustain itself on its own terms. Now, everything I've just said probably either sounds great or horrible. Because here's the thing, Eternal is demanding. Maybe the most demanding FPS I've ever played. It doesn't let you coast, it doesn't let you stop for a second, and it doesn't let you hide behind one favorite gun. It's a combat system that you really have to be in the mood for. But if you embrace the conversation it's trying to have with you, it's generous. Almost startlingly so. Look at the extra life system as an example of that. On paper, it's a classic Mario-style one-up. Run out of health? The game burns the token and drops you right back into the action with a fresh bar and a little window of invulnerability. In practice, the game telling you, we don't actually want you sitting through 30 seconds of reload screens every time you mistime a dash. It's not actually punishing in that way. The Dark Ages carries the same idea forward out of a shared design philosophy. Both games want to keep you in the fight, and more importantly, they want you to feel as cool as possible while you're doing it. Dying has to be optional to achieve that. To sum up my thoughts on it, Eternal gives you all the tools you'll need to save Earth from heaven and hell. It teaches you how to talk to it, and then, once you're fluent, it never stops listening. One of the first things I think everybody noticed about the Dark Ages is how it immediately hands you much deeper pockets than either 2016 or Eternal ever did. Ammo is plentiful, almost embarrassingly so, and if you ever run low, the game happily doles out more whenever you take a swing with your fists or flail. Depending on what you think these games should be, this is probably either a comforting safety net or a worrying sign of loosened discipline. Eternal was, as I've just talked about, the stingiest of the trilogy, pushing you to swap weapons constantly. 2016 struck a sort of middle ground. The Dark Ages, by contrast, says, hey, pick a gun you like and just keep shooting until it feels boring. And that's kind of liberating. In Eternal, running out of ammo was the central conceit of the entire combat loop. You weren't supposed to main a weapon. You were supposed to rotate through them like a chef working stations in a kitchen. Chainsaw this guy for ammo, flame belch that crowd for armor, ice bomb the stragglers. Meanwhile, you're swapping to the plasma rifle because your rocket launcher is dry, and the combat shotgun's only loaded with shame. In the Dark Ages, that problem basically evaporated. You don't need to touch every instrument in the band. You can sit with the saxophone all night if you feel like it. This isn't to say weapon choice has no meaning or texture. The standard combat shotgun, for example, sneakily inherits the flame belcher's job from Eternal. Put some fire on an enemy, shoot them, and out spills armor like a little vending machine. But this time, it feels less like a key mechanic and more like a side benefit, especially since armor recovery is now generously available from other avenues. It's useful, sure, but rarely essential. In fact, until I sat down to write the script, I didn't even properly notice that's what it did. The weirder bit about the combat loop, the thing that I'm still not really all that sold on, to be honest, is the alternate fire modes and the changes made to them. On paper, they're a way of adding depth and options, but in practice, they mostly act as slightly better versions of the weapon you already had. As I've already talked about, the combat shotgun versus the super shotgun makes some sort of sense, but outside of a few meaningful contrasts like that, most alternate modes don't really feel like choices, they're just flat upgrades. Why toggle back to the accelerator when the cycler is so much better at clearing rooms? The second thing you're likely to notice is new and different, and the one that really changes the texture of the whole experience is, of course, the shield. With it, the Slayer really does cut the figure of a terrifying medieval knight, equal parts barbarian, king, and Arthurian, only with the addition of a full bandolier of shotgun shells, of course. Every green projectile that streaks across the arena is parryable, and can be turned back on its sender, and the timing, on Hurt Me Plenty at least, is shockingly generous. There was a lot of chatter before release about the adjustable difficulty sliders, how the game lets you fine-tune almost every system, but personally I can't really speak to any of that because I was happy to leave them alone. The default felt like the intended experience, the one balanced for maximum momentum, and that seemed like the right place to be. Like Eternal before, the Dark Ages wants you to feel powerful, to engage with its mechanics not just because you're desperate, but because they're fun, and it rewards you for stepping into that rhythm. And parrying, in particular, feels better than I would have expected from a first-person shooter. Regardless of your choice of weapon, you can stand and fight most anything in the game, batting away lethal damage like it's nothing, all because of the inclusion of the shield. It symbolizes, I think, that new play-your-way ethos that drives the violent engine of the Dark Ages, and I found it really difficult to adjust to not having it when going back to play the previous titles for this video. It's kind of funny that 2025 gave us 2 games built around parrying in places where it traditionally doesn't make much sense. Doom, of all things, asking you to stand still in the middle of a firefight and block and parry, when really it's usually been all about speed and movement, to avoid damage. An Expedition 33, a turn-based RPG, slipping in these little moments where you've got to react on the spot instead of just planning ahead. Neither idea should really work, but somehow both of them absolutely do, and they've ended up being the 2 games I've sunk the most time into this year. Thinking about it, I'd love to do a video on Expedition. Anyway. The shield buffs are another neat encapsulation of this whole pick-your-own approach. There are 4 of them, unlocked across the campaign, and they all trigger on parry. In theory, they each solve a different problem. But, to be honest, when playing the game, they didn't really feel like tactical necessities. They felt more like 4 flavors of ice cream, You pick the one you like, you stick with it, and you don't really ever feel compelled to switch it up in every encounter. The Fire Stomp is basically Eternal's flamethrower on a bit of a 2-for-1 deal. Set enemies ablaze, hit them and armor spills out, and do quite a bit of damage to the whole area while you're doing it. It's a solid option if you enjoy not dying. The Magic Swarm is technically about pumping out a lot of damage, I think, though in my playthrough it felt far weaker than the rest of the options. I unlocked it, I tried it, and then I didn't really go back to it. Maybe I missed something with them, and if they're your favorite option, sorry, I guess. I haven't done them justice. The auto turret was my go-to. You parry, it punishes the thing you just parried, and you get a lot of health for your troubles. Simple, reliable, and straightforward, and to be honest, the main reason for me is it looked really, really cool. The last option is the lightning burst, that stuns everything on screen and makes them more vulnerable to the rest of the damage you can spit out. It sounds pretty great, but again, it's just an option, not a demand. I guess in theory you'd constantly swap runes to match the situation. Use the stomp or lightning for crowds, and the turret for bosses. In reality, I don't think anybody is pausing mid-fight to fiddle with menus for what amounts to seasoning. It's a system that's less about efficiency and more about self-expression. Pick whatever makes your Doomslayer feel cool to you. The melee weapons follow the same philosophy. You've got 3 options, each built around a different combat reward, and none of them are mandatory. What's interesting is that none of these options really shift the core of combat. You don't need the flail to survive any given encounter, you don't need the gauntlets to progress. They're ways of leaning into the rhythm you already enjoy. In the Dark Ages, the melee and shield systems feel like they're almost tripping over themselves to please you. Sticking with the melee system for a second, the Dark Ages leans into melee in a way that neither of its predecessors really did. The game wants you swinging your flail or punching your way through a horde constantly, building your rhythm around it, and it structures the whole ammo economy around rewarding you for doing so. Enemies try to get in on the act too. There's fewer snipers lurking in the background, more big guys sprinting right at you with cudgels raised. It's a brawl in the Dark Ages, less about darting around the perimeter and more about holding your ground and trading blows. Glory kills are interestingly de-emphasized too. At least they feel lesser than they have in the previous 2 games. They're still there, obviously, still serving the same mechanical purpose, spit out health when you land the finishing blow, but they feel pared down. The wild, slapstick, gloriously gruesome energy of Eternal's finishers has been dialed way back. Often it's just a single flail swing, or a swift kick, quick and functional. On my first run, I was almost let down by how muted they all seemed. To be honest, I thought maybe they were bugged in some way. It was only on my second playthrough that I actually found out that you can still coax out some more gruesome animations, seemingly if you trigger them mid-jump. But even then, they're quicker, cleaner, and less full of personality than anything you'll find in Eternal. Ultimately, I'm of 2 minds. On the one hand, it speeds up combat and keeps you relentlessly destroying every demon on screen as quickly as possible. It's all forward motion all of the time. But even this is its own double-edged sword, as the glory kills often served as little breaks for me. Whether that was intentional or not, they were a breather to get reoriented in the maelstrom of combat, which you no longer really get. On the other hand, it tears down a little of the personality of Doom. We've already talked about the humor and vibe that those more slapstick and highly animated glory kills injected in Eternal. Each demon had its own unique glory kills, which lent them all a little different personality as you rip and tear through that game. By sanding down that excess, the Dark Ages feels just a little bit more solemn, almost austere in a way, which I think's a funny word to use for a game that also lets you swat neon green orbs around like it's demon-slaying tennis. The result of all the things that I've talked about here is a weapon system that feels less demanding than Eternal's, but also less disciplinary too. Eternal imposed its vision of combat on you, hard. Play this way, press the right button at the right time, or suffer. And I learned to love it for its vision. The Dark Ages never does that. It trusts you to set your own rhythm, to decide whether you want to swap constantly or just cozy up to a favorite gun and make it your emotional support boomstick.
Yeah. This is my boomstick!
Whether that's a step forward or a step backward probably depends on what you liked about Doom in the first place. You get something a little messier, a little more self-expressive, maybe a little less elegant, but also a game that's happy to get out of your way and let you play it however you want. The opening levels give us an opportunity to talk about the 2 headline additions the Dark Ages brings to the table, lumbering around in the giant mech and swooping through the sky on Dragonback. Now maybe those sound like the kinds of things that should redefine the whole game, but if you've played it, well, you know that they end up feeling mechanically sparse, maybe even a little underwhelming. Not bad, certainly not unwelcome, just, I guess, surprising in their restraint, especially when you compare them to how dense and overwhelming the on-foot combat usually is. But actually, I don't think that's an entirely bad thing. So let's unpack that a little. The 3rd level of the game hands you the keys to an Atlan, a giant mech built by the Night Sentinels, something that we've seen time and time again in the backgrounds and as set dressing throughout Doom Eternal in particular. This time it points you at the barrier core with the job of trying to save Hebeth. Hopefully that name rings some bells. Hebeth, the one we picked over as ruins in Eternal, revealed here in its prime. The not-so-twist, of course, is that Hebeth is also Mars, back before humanity showed up and renamed it. It's fine, I guess, a neat callback, though not one that really adds all that much. Because we already knew the Sentinels had a history on Mars, so stamping Hebeth on this particular level, it doesn't really deepen the lore so much as it just reminds you that the writers remember their own notes. Still, what's a Doom game without at least one trip to Mars? They had to fit it in somewhere, I guess. Mechanically, the Atlan is a big departure from the Slayer's usual tempo. Instead of manic improvisation, it's comparatively slow, deliberate and centered on trading massive haymakers with titans, the giant demons that usually have served as cinematic backdrops and set dressing, now pulled onto the stage as sparring partners for you. You punch, you charge a bigger punch, occasionally you dodge. At certain points you're even given a minigun that puts the maxi in mini. But it doesn't really change that basic attack-dodge rhythm. And that's about it from a gameplay point of view. The Atlan gameplay, it's not complicated, and I don't think it's trying to be. The best thing to do is to grab a good pair of headphones and enjoy the booming sound effects as you tear through Titans one at a time. What's more interesting to discuss, well, for me at least, is the lore wrapper. The Codex tells us the tale of the Titans, quote, once peaceful giants who roamed their verdant world as guardians. The Titans were ill-suited for the true nature of warfare, and they were utterly outmatched by the legions of hell. With their forms twisted by the dark realm's malice, and their minds enslaved by hell's war priests, these towering demons lay waste to untold worlds, unquote. It's a weirdly somber note, considering what you're doing for these sections is climbing into a sentinel megazord and cracking skulls open like walnuts. There's a tonal dissonance there, for me. The text mourns these fallen giants, but the game's asking you to stuff bombs down their throats and throw them into bottomless pits. Now, I guess the easy thing to say here is Doom Guy, well, he doesn't seem troubled by ethical nuances, so who am I to argue with him? Because, despite the dissonance, I think the mech sections really work. Now, they're never going to set the world on fire mechanically, this isn't Armored Core after all, but they don't need to. What they offer is variety, and more importantly a breather from the Slayer's endless sprint through Hellfire arenas. If you zoom out just a little, the mech levels fit into a long lineage of what I call palate cleanser sequences in shooters. Half-Life 2 had the airboat and the buggy, letting you breathe between its more claustrophobic firefights. Halo was always good for the occasional Scorpion tank section, where suddenly you're flattening the Covenant infantry who normally would be terrifying threats. Tank beats everything, after all. The Dark Ages Atlans sections land in that same category. They're not there to compete with the core combat loop because nothing really can. They're there to give you contrast. Eternal and the Dark Ages, they both live in this relentless, adrenalized headspace where you're processing 6 or 7 decisions a second. And without something to break that up, I think the whole campaign could start to feel like one long song played at max volume constantly. The mech is a chance to change the tempo. Drop the BPM way down, give you something visually spectacular, and let you feel a different flavor of power for a couple of minutes at a time. What I appreciate is that id kept them short. There's always the temptation, I think, to build a whole subsystem around these kinds of ideas, to try to turn the mech into its own fully featured mode. But as I say, Doom doesn't need an Armored Core side hustle. I think it just needs a moment where you punch a Titan so hard its face caves in like paper mache. Then it hands you back to the Slayer and says, alright, where were we? The Outland sections aren't the only time the Dark Ages plays with tempo. A few levels later, the game hands you a very different kind of war machine. This time it's alive. To defend the floating city of Aratum, you basically get handed your base Jake Sully cosplay assignment. Go tame a dragon. Now officially the game calls them Wintherans, but let's be honest, they're dragons. They live in a colossal ribcage left behind by some unfathomable leviathan, a space the Sentinels have turned into a Drake Eyrie. This is where we meet Serat. The dragon will actually be riding into battle. He's scarred, armoured, and radiates just the right amount of menace to look at home under the Doomslayer. He's also, in his own way, the goodest boy the series has ever given us. Just as the mech trades Doom's usual speed for weight and impact, Serat trades it for scale. The dragon segments are less about brawling. In fact, there's barely anything you could reasonably call combat while you're in the air. As I say, it's more about the spectacle, sweeping you through the sky while you blast at fortresses the size of cities. And the arenas you are given to fly around in are appropriately colossal. What really makes these sections work, and why I think they edge out the Atlan mech segments for me, is how much room they leave for exploration. Every so often you'll catch sight of a hellship carving across the sky, trailing neon contrails like someone snuck a bit of Tron into the art direction. Officially, they're targets for your miniguns, a way to remind you that yes, this is still Doom, and you should probably be shooting at something most of the time. But they also double as breadcrumb trails, subtly pointing out the corners of the arena you might have missed. If you follow their paths, more often than not you'll find yourself intersecting with optional landing pads, little pockets of side content that make the whole space feel less like a one-and-done set piece, and more like a place you're encouraged to comb through. Especially when you get a permanent health boost or armor boost for your troubles. In terms of gameplay, these sequences feel closer to a rail shooter than anything else. a sort of simplified Star Fox by way of heavy metal album cover art. Mechanically, they're really straightforward. Steer, shoot, dodge a little. I can certainly see an argument that it's all too simple, having to constantly stop flying to hover and shoot at weak points while occasionally dodging a green projectile to empower your weapon. Yeah, it's super simplistic stuff. But again, I think that simplicity is the point. These sequences aren't designed to rival the Slayer's on-foot arsenal, more so just to give you a breather and a couple different flavors of power fantasy. Where the Atlan made you slow and unstoppable, Surratt makes you fast and untouchable. The contrast is nice, even if admittedly neither system is deep enough to carry a game by itself. I've read quite a bit of criticism for both types of sequences online, and I can't argue really. I guess I have it reframed slightly in my head though. These sequences occupy the space left by the absence of the traversal sequences in Eternal. The other thing Surratt brings to the table, beyond giving you an excuse to do aerial dogfights, is a surprising bit of character work for the Slayer himself. For most of the series he's been defined by absence. No dialogue, no hesitation, just a void shaped like rage. But with Surratt, you get these fleeting moments where maybe the mask slips just a little. Watching him stop to stoop and pick up a severed demon arm to feed his dragon, it's not exactly tender I guess, but it is the closest thing to warmth we've ever seen from him. It suggests that even someone as single-minded and apocalyptic as the Doomslayer can have a soft spot. So long as that soft spot also breathes fire, I guess. And then there's Surratt's death at the hands of Azrak. It doesn't turn the Slayer into a tragic hero, and the game doesn't linger on it long enough to make him suddenly vulnerable or complicated. What it does instead is show that he can feel something beyond fury. A flicker of grief, quickly transmuted back into violence as he racks the shotgun and raises the shield for the next round. It's not a big swing at emotional storytelling, but it's a small, effective reminder that the Doomslayer isn't just a weapon. He's a person, a terrifying, world-ending person, sure, but one who mourns the loss of his pet dragon all the same. While we prepare for the siege, let's talk about the level design evolution in the Dark Ages. Broadly speaking, the game has 4 flavors of levels. Dragon-focused and mech-focused, as we've talked about, your standard linear Doom corridors, and the larger-scale battlefield maps. A couple stages will try to blend those categories together, but that's the basic setup we're working with. The siege gives us a chance to zoom in on that last kind, though, the battlefield-style levels. On the surface, they're the most open and broad levels in the new trilogy. But underneath, they're still doing the same Doom things they've always done. Stringing together arenas where demons warp in, you kill them, and then the next door opens. In Doom 2016, it was all sterile research labs and sci-fi corridors, leading you from one fight to the next. Here it's ramparts and muddy fields, dotted with trebuchets and crumbling towers. The aesthetic has changed, but the bones of the encounter design hasn't. Which is appropriate for a game subtitled The Dark Ages, I guess. Here we fight on the Pelennor fields, or outside Helm's Deep, or we fly a dragon over the white walls of Minas Tirith itself. 2016's levels often felt claustrophobic, forcing you to ping-pong around combat spaces like a rat in a blood-soaked maze. Eternal opened things up, building more verticality into its arenas, and then used traversal, grappling hooks, monkey bars, and air dashes to turn arenas into your own personal jungle gym. The Dark Ages pares some of that back. Traversal is still there, of course, but it's less pronounced this time around. The speed you have comes from a sprint and, of course, the shield charge, turning the Doomslayer into a sort of hyper-violent version of Captain America. Hugo Martin, the creative director of 2016 and Eternal, and now the game director for the Dark Ages, summed up the shift in design philosophy pretty well, I think. Quote, "In Doom Eternal, you felt like a fighter jet. In Doom the Dark Ages, you'll be an iron tank. Heavy, strong, but still fast." End quote. And honestly, I can't think of a better way to frame the contrast myself. It's more horizontal than Eternal's vertical playgrounds too, but the shield lets you move with perhaps even more speed than Eternal. Just in, I guess, quicker bursts, stops and starts. You shift gracefully from standing toe-to-toe with the biggest demons, the Mancubi, the Pinky Riders, the Vagaries and the Komodos, to shield rushing down a group of fodder demons and gleefully watching them burst under your impact. I don't think the Slayer has felt more impactful than he does here in the Dark Ages. Taken as a whole, The Trilogy's level design feels like it's been testing the elastic limit of a very specific loop. 2016 reintroduced the basic form, tight, claustrophobic arenas. Eternal stretched it upward, layering on traversal and systems until the arenas felt like three-dimensional chess, and the Dark Ages stretches it outward, embedding those arenas in sprawling battlefields and mythic landscapes. The DNA hasn't changed, but the presentation has kept mutating, just enough to stave off fatigue, at least for me. The Cosmic Realm is where Doom the Dark Ages really leans into its strangest, most eldritch visuals, and most interesting puzzle design. It really feels like the designers let themselves get a little weirder here, and it certainly pays off. The whole sequence begins after Commander Thera gets snatched up by one of the Cosmic Realm's ever-present tentacles through a portal to another dimension. To rescue her means traveling to Azkaban. A bleak, remote island beset by deeply atmospheric rainfall and demons, of course. The place feels like the doomed last line of a sailor's log, all salt-scoured rock and storms pounding the coast. Rising out of sea spray and lashing rain is the spire of Nerothal, a broken tower the Sentinels and the Wraiths once used as a cosmic prison to a god from another dimension. For now, it's wrapped tight, a chrysalis waiting to hatch something better left asleep. You fight your way down through it, a reversal of the usual climb the tower to rescue the princess structure, switching between dragon-mounted sequences and on-foot treks to the cosmic locks, and as you go deeper, the design folds in the wreckage of ships dashed against the rocks outside. The visual layering of ruined stone and mold-infested wood, shattered masts, and the colossal, moss-lined caverns gives this section a texture I think the rest of the game never quite matches. Now that's not to say the rest of the game isn't stunning, because, well, it obviously is. But it's here, and the subsequent levels, Ryul, and especially the haunting cosmic ship graveyard on the way to the Temple of Lomarith, all shattered ship masts and sea mist, the vast cosmic ocean and the imposing tower in the background, the whole thing bathed in an eerie purple glow, where I most often found myself pausing just to look around. So anyway, before I get too off track, I'll summarize the story for this section of the game. We're storming a spire to break open a god's cocoon with a BF crossbow, all so we can enter the Cosmic Realm and save a princess from a witch. Wait, what game are we playing again? Anyway, visually the Cosmic Realm has the same DNA as Skyrim's Apocrypha Zone from the Dragonborn DLC. Another case of a team deciding that if they're going to channel Lovecraft, they're going to do it loudly. The whole place is sculpted from squirming tentacle motifs, eldritch statues that seem to be watching you, crooked obelisks, and a colour palette of a sickly emerald green. The puzzles borrow from that imagery too, taking on the shape of the eldritch nightmare. There are corridors that stretch longer than they should. Endless corridor tricks. Underwater tunnels that feel dreamlike, even if the swimming gameplay itself is painfully slow. Whole rooms that tilt and rotate as though the space itself is shrugging at your attempts to map it. There are interruptions between firefights, moments where the game pauses to say, hey, what if this level didn't actually want you here? Which for me is a good thing in a game where progress is usually measured in enemies left unsawn. That said, it's not all puzzles, of course. There's still plenty of bloodletting to be done. The Cosmic Barons are probably the standout new enemies here, both in terms of visual design and the rhythm they force on combat. They are these big, imposing duels that punctuate the exploration, relentlessly swinging with their saw blade arms, forcing you into a more defensive mindset than most encounters engender. During my first playthrough, I didn't really appreciate how useful the chain shot was, but once it's upgraded to fully charge after parries, the game really does adopt a rhythm reminiscent of a Souls game. A rhythm that the Cosmic Barons really celebrate. My only nitpick, and it's minor, but once I thought of it I couldn't unthink it, is that I kind of wish more of the enemies had been reskinned for the Cosmic Realm. The Barons are a great example of what could have been, and it leaves you imagining a version of the realm where even the familiar foes had been given that same alien treatment. Just imagine a cacodemon filtered through tentacles and nautical nightmares. What could have been, eh? But while we're talking about the great level design and puzzles, something I think the Dark Ages uniformly handles really well, there's something I don't think the trilogy has quite nailed, and that's its relationship with secrets. In fact, I'd argue it's slowly backed away from what made them exciting in the first place. 2016 kept secrets, actually secret. You might stumble across one or two organically, but more often than not, you really had to work for it. Or, more likely, go to a guide. You had to push at the edges of the level geometry, think about vertical space, notice that odd vent in the corner that didn't seem like it led anywhere. Finding a secret felt like pulling a thread and discovering the whole sweater had a hidden lining. And the reward usually justified the trouble. You got to play slices of the original Doom. Now for me that's a payoff, not just a collectible but a tiny nostalgia museum built right into the game itself. A reminder that the franchise had history, and you just dug up a piece of it. It managed to feel celebratory, without pandering. Nostalgia folded into the design in a way that made sense, whether you were new to the series or had been there since dial-up modems. By the time Eternal came out, the definition of secret had already softened. The rewards had shifted entirely from gameplay to toys. Doom Guy's room slowly filled up with action figures as you played through the campaign, lined neatly on the shelves like Funko Pops curated by the angriest man alive. I don't dislike it entirely, to be honest. There's something quite endearing about Doom Guy being this unstoppable force of violence who also carefully arranged his Barbies. But I don't know, this might be a harsh read, but it feels like a little bit like the team at id are saying, the Doom Slayer may be hell's worst nightmare, but he's also a nerd with a display cabinet. Just like you, player. I don't know. The Dark Ages keeps the toys, but it strips away the only part that made them interesting. There's no space to display them now. They just go into a menu somewhere, which means they're effectively invisible the moment you pick them up. The act of collecting in the Dark Ages feels, perfunctory at best. Just another line item in a checklist to tick off. I guess if you're someone who needs to 100% every level, that might well be enough. The dopamine drip of seeing the completion bar fill up. But for me, the secrets have become secrets in name only. A collectible you already know about, sitting in a place the game will guide you to, with a reward you'll likely never look at again. It's a little bit of a strange arc for a series that used to treat secrets like something important. What began as hidden doors that led to pieces of Doom's past has ended with optional trinkets that don't even bother to leave the box. I don't really have a neat place to put this, but it does feel like a natural follow-up from the point about secrets. The way nostalgia and commercialization have gotten tangled up over the course of this trilogy. It's something that's been hanging over the series as it's gone on, so I did want to just stop here for a minute and pick at it. Eternal had, as I've already mentioned, a crass commercial streak to it. Skins, nostalgia, cosmetics, and meme culture, it all got bundled up into this kind of neon bright, gaudy packaging. I already said that it was a part of the reason I bounced off Eternal back in 2021, and I don't think it's aged any more gracefully in the years since. For me, playing Eternal sometimes felt like walking through the world's loudest HMV, where every surface had been merchandised to death, every bit of retro flair had a price tag attached. Now, of course, the obvious retort is that it's all optional, and that's true, Doom is certainly not the worst franchise I love when it comes to trying to commercialize any and every drip of nostalgia. But anyway, almost as a response to the neon-drenched visuals of Eternal, the Dark Ages eases way off on the gas there. It's refreshing, honestly, to sit down with a single-player campaign that isn't saddled with a multiplayer mode that nobody will still be playing in 6 weeks, or a battle pass dangling shiny distractions just over the horizon if you just manage to slay a couple more cacodemons. In many ways, the Dark Ages is just a shooter again. And that fundamentally feels good. But it didn't completely abandon the commercial trimmings either. Instead of pushing you toward microtransactions, it's mostly tied cosmetics to real-world brand deals. Buy some partner company's thing, get a skin. Buy a pizza, get a new look for your Slayer. And sure, it's all optional, purely cosmetic. You can ignore it, scroll past it, pretend it isn't there. But for me, there's something about the practice that rubs me the wrong way when you stack it up against what Doom is supposed to be, and what the new trilogy has been trying to be. This is a franchise built on being defiantly old school, and it really tries to play up nostalgia member berries constantly. The 2016 reboot even pitched itself as a kind of a love letter to that spirit. Eternal was pitched as a rejection of all those modern mobile gaming trends. Which makes it all the stranger that somewhere in the middle of that rhetoric, Bethesda greenlit a mobile spin-off. You know, Mighty Doom, remember that? That embraced those exact trends with both arms and a bear hug. Alas, gone too soon. Watching something you like slowly get warped by corporate tie-ins feels weird. I'm sorry, but it just does. F1 decals might look fine on F1 cars, I guess, but they look decidedly less fine on a Demon Slayer's shield. None of it breaks the Dark Ages, and none of it gets in the way of what's otherwise a focused, confident campaign. And if it helps pay to keep the lights on at id, then who am I to argue? But it does leave a faintly greasy fingerprint on a series that started out trying to feel timeless. Anyway, I'll get down off my soapbox. Let's get back to the story. I think the last thing to talk about is the name of the video. The Dark Souls Ages. Look, I'll hold my hands up. It's a mostly facetious, tongue-in-cheek title that hopefully did its job in getting you to click the video. In many, many ways, Doom the Dark Ages is not like Dark Souls. It's not slow or melancholy or punishing in the ways that series often is. What Doom the Dark Ages is over the top, silly, gruesomely gory, and gratuitously, unapologetically fun. In some ways, I guess the relentless ripping and tearing is more similar to Bloodborne, but again, the tenor, the way it goes about relaying that fantasy, is just so obviously, viscerally different. But look, I've arbitrarily forced myself to talk about Dark Souls, so let's run with it for a second. There are, as I see it, precisely 3 reasons it's similar to Dark Souls. We've already talked about 2 of them, the lore snippets found in levels that help build up a sense of the world outside of the orbit of our player avatar, that describe events long since past. It's fundamentally Souls-like. Now, the Souls games weren't the first to deliver story and lore in this way, but I'd argue they're the best known, and likely the biggest influence on the way the Dark Ages and the NuDOOM Trilogy overall have chosen to deliver large chunks of their storytelling. The second is the basic aesthetic. If you actually slow down and walk through some of these villages, they do actually give off a similar vibe to the Souls games. Hollowed out and abandoned villages, Lovecraftian nightmares chained to the inside of spires. You get the idea. The third, I've waited till last to talk about, because it was the oddest shift in the Dark Ages for me. It's the boss fights, and in particular the main one with Azrak, the Prince of Hell himself. It's a multi-stage encounter with a boss that revolves around recognizing distinct attack patterns and chains of attacks, parrying at the right time and returning fire in those safety windows between his assaults. It flows like a Souls boss, in a way I didn't really expect a first-person shooter boss fight could. To be honest, I usually loathe first-person shooter boss fights. They regularly spoil the fantasy of these iconic characters entirely, which I know is an odd thing to say as somebody who has nearly 2,000 hours in Destiny 2. But let me focus in on one for a second to try and explain what I mean. Bassus in Halo Infinite. The fight with Bassus takes place in a control tower. By that I mean a tight, confined space. And tight, confined spaces, they don't really mesh well with an extremely angry space monkey wielding a gravity hammer. Now it should be tense. It should be claustrophobic in a deliberate way. But instead, the encounter collapses almost immediately into scrambling, running away from one-hit kills, trying to bait his swings, and watching him leap halfway across the room to close the gap, no matter how much distance you think you've bought yourself. To me, it doesn't really feel like much of a duel. The mechanics don't help. Switching between the Massachusetts grappling hook and dodge ability is clumsy to say the least on a controller. At least it is for me, so I stuck with the grappling hook as a sort of desperate bid for control over the spacing in the fight, yanking myself out of Bassus's range and then weakly plinking at his overly tanky shields with, well, whatever weapon I had to hand. Speaking of shields, replaying this fight happened to send me on one of those deep internet rabbit holes I get lost in every now and again. You know, just how durable is Mjolnir armor supposed to be? Because from my deep and extensive internet research, well, the numbers, they just don't add up. I guess it really is impossible to try and reconcile bulletproof super soldier with a video game where your health bar still runs out. Ultimately, I ended up reinstalling Halo 3 for the umpteenth time. Because if the armor can survive falling from orbit like that, well, it should probably be able to take a couple of swings from an overgrown gorilla with a stick. I don't know, that's just me thinking out loud. Sticking with Doom though, I think the Dark Ages represents a huge step in the right direction for me from previous attempts in the franchise when it comes to boss fights. Eternal is a great game. I really hope I've conveyed that up to this point, but the main boss fights, they're uniformly terrible. Let's start with the Gladiator, an arena duel with a towering armored brute with a really cool living shield design, stretched across 2 distinct phases. The problem is he spends far too much time turtling behind that shield, and when he does finally swing, the timing window for retaliation felt far too tight. I'd bait out his mace attacks, but half the time I'd mistime the dodge, take chip damage anyway, and get locked into the same dance over and over again. I haven't talked about them all that much in this video, but he fights similarly to how you fight the Marauder mini-bosses throughout the game. The second phase was admittedly slightly better. With the shield gone, the fight opens up and the Gladiator's aggression at least makes it feel closer to a proper duel. I'll also say the 2-whip jump rope move was a pretty fun addition to his moveset. Now I'm happy to chalk up a lot of my frustration here to a skill issue on my part. My reaction times simply weren't up to the pace the fight demanded, and the game doesn't bend over backwards to make allowances. But even so, I think there's a difference between being punished for mistakes and being asked to sit through an encounter that just doesn't play to the strengths of the larger game. Eternal is at its best when it gives you options, when it lets you dart, dash, and improvise your way through chaos. The Gladiator feels like the opposite of that. Slow and deliberate and one note. It's a cool design, he's got a striking presence, but yeah, it just wasn't a fun fight in the slightest for me. Your mileage may vary. The Icon of Sin, the wrapped Doom Eternal, was so miserable an experience for me that it soured me on even wanting to play the Ancient Gods at all. The setup has the icon standing out of bounds, looming in the distance while you chip away at him piece by piece. Your objective is to break individual body parts. An arm here, a chest plate there, while waves of every demon you've already fought for hours and hours spill into the arena to harass you. The icon himself throws in a few token attacks of his own, slamming his fists or shooting fireballs. His attacks and, well, even his look, they echoed the old Iron King in Dark Souls 2. Or maybe that's just me. I don't know. Instead of feeling like you're dueling the apocalyptic embodiment of hell's power, the icon is mostly reduced to stage dressing, a giant backdrop you gradually whittle down between clearing ads. And you have to do the entire process twice. My successful run clocked in at just under 10 minutes of uninterrupted running, gunning, and plate spinning. That feels like a long time to me to be doing essentially the same loop, and by the end, the fight didn't feel climactic. It just felt like work. The disappointment isn't purely mechanical either. The icon is supposed to be the narrative culmination of Eternal's story. He's the final boss after all. And as I already mentioned earlier, the background lore, Valen's betrayal in this deformed resurrection that was set up near the start of Eternal, the reason Argent D'Nur fell to Hell's forces, the reason every action you take in the Dark Ages is doomed to fail, it's all supposed to culminate in this boss fight. But for all the theoretical build-up, he ends up more prop than character, more gimmick than a real antagonist. Eternal spends so much time deepening the Slayer's mythos, broadening the cosmology of the Doom universe, and then it caps it all off with... I don't know. To say nothing at all feels harsh, but it really is a big nothing to me. The Slayer doesn't care, Valen's nowhere to be seen, so why should I care? It's a fight that's big in scale, but completely hollow in impact. And that's a real shame. Eternal is otherwise a pitch-perfect experience. Kinetic, inventive, demanding in the best ways. But the bosses, and especially the Icon of Sin, just fall so far short of the rest of the experience. None of that is true with Azrak. From a story perspective, he's been the primary antagonist throughout. He even killed Surat. So there's a catharsis in throwing down and coming out the victor, even if the actual story wraps up with a shrug and a see you next time. From a gameplay perspective, with the inclusion of the shield and parrying, Doom the Dark Ages lets you stand and fight, to react. It's still hard, don't get me wrong, but it's hard in a way that feels fun to deal with, and not the mad scramble that made me think of the Master Chief as less super soldier savior of mankind, and more fraud and an expensive plastic suit of armor. Look, all I'm saying is give me an energy shield, Halo. I need that way more than I need ADS. I don't want to end on a sour note, but just as Doom the Dark Ages campaign, the only game mode the game came with on release, finished abruptly without tying up, well, anything really. You know, the Witch is still theoretically out there. The great betrayal of the Night Sentinels hasn't happened yet, though I guess at least we did get a name drop and a brief cameo of Valen's son, Marok. And we still didn't get to see how the Doom guy got in the coffin from the start of 2016. What I'm saying is this: if the game can wrap up abruptly, so can I. I guess I'll see you when the DLC eventually drops. Thanks for watching.
Wake up, samurai. We have a city to burn.